The Longest Road Home. A story of a bitter heart, an unexpected rescue, and the love that broke through. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. He had not spoken a kind word to a neighbor in 11 years. Not since his wife passed. Not since the last of his family had stopped calling. Not since the town of Harlow, Georgia had quietly, collectively decided that Earl Pruitt was a man best left alone. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the specific, tired recognition that some people have built their walls so high and so long that the cost of climbing them exceeds what most people are willing to pay. Earl Pruitt was 74 years old. He lived alone in a house on the rural edge of Harlow that needed painting and didn't get it. He drove a truck that had seen better decades. He came into town for groceries on the first Tuesday of every month and spoke to no one he did not have to speak to, and said nothing when he had to speak that contained warmth. He was known in Harlow for two things. The first was his bitterness, which was visible from a distance and which people navigated around the way you navigate around weather. The second was his views, which were not whispered about or euphemized in private conversation among people who had lived near him long enough to have heard them stated plainly. On people who did not look like him. On a Thursday night in October, in the middle of a thunderstorm that came off the mountains with the specific ferocity that Georgia autumn storms sometimes carry, Earl Pruitt's truck left the road on Route 9 and went into the drainage ditch at the base of the embankment. The first people to stop were a young couple on their way home from a late dinner in the next county. Their names were Tobias and Della Simmons. They were black. What happened in the next 40 minutes on the side of Route 9 in a Georgia thunderstorm is the reason this story exists. Before we move forward with the story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to help us to grow this channel to uplift more people. To understand what it meant for Earl Pruitt to receive help from Tobias and Della Simmons, you have to understand where Earl came from. He was born in 1950 in Harlow, Georgia, the third generation of a family that had farmed the same land through the Depression, through the war years, through the slow economic changes that had made the farm first difficult and then impossible. His grandfather had been a hard man shaped by hard times. His father, Raymond, had inherited the hardness along with the land and had added to it a specific set of beliefs about the social order that were in Harlow, Georgia, in the 1950s and 1960s. Not merely his own views, but the ambient air of the community he moved through. Earl had absorbed those beliefs the way children absorb everything, not through a single lesson, but through the accumulation of what was said at the dinner table and what was said on the front porch, and what was said between men who trusted each other, and what was never questioned because the community around him reflected it back without friction. He did not learn hatred through a dramatic event. He learned it through repetition, through the language that was used without hesitation, through the specific social architecture of a segregated town that communicated, through its every arrangement, a hierarchy that the people at the top of it had every reason to accept, and no one around Earl had ever challenged. He had carried it into adulthood, into his marriage to a woman named June who was gentler than him and who had, over 40 years, softened some of his edges without ever fully reaching the ones that ran deepest. June had died 8 years ago. The softening had gone with her. He had carried it into old age. He had never examined it. He had never had a reason to. The community's relationship with Earl Pruitt was the relationship of people who have learned to route around an obstacle. The man at the hardware store was polite to him because being polite was the path of least resistance. The woman at the grocery checkout who had drawn the short straw on the first Tuesday of each month managed the transaction efficiently and without engagement because efficiency was the kindest available option. The reverend at the Baptist church, which Earl had not attended in 6 years since June's funeral, had made one visit after June's passing and had received a reception cold enough to make a second visit unnecessary. The Simmons family, Tobias's parents, Clarence and Ruth, who had lived 3 miles from Earl's property for 30 years, had navigated his particular brand of hostility with the practiced, dignified patience of people who had been navigating that specific thing their entire lives and who had decided, a long time ago, that it said nothing about them and everything about him. Clarence Simmons had once waved at Earl from a tractor. Earl had not waved back. The community knew this about Earl. It was not a secret. It was simply a feature of Harlow that people had accommodated in the way you accommodate a tree that has grown in an inconvenient place. You go around it, and over time you stop noticing you're going around it. Nobody disliked Earl enough to confront him. Nobody liked him enough to pursue him. He existed in a specific kind of social isolation that he had built himself, and that had become, over the years, the only way he knew how to exist. He was lonely in the way of a man who would not have admitted loneliness with a gun to his head, but whose house, on the evenings when the quiet was specific enough, was a particular kind of quiet that only people who have lost everyone know. The storm came in from the northwest around 8 o'clock Thursday evening. Earl had been in town later than usual. The hardware store had held him up, and then the pharmacy. And by the time he was on Route 9 heading back toward the property, the rain was coming in sheets and the wind was doing what October wind does in the Georgia mountains when it gets moving. He was 74 years old. His night vision was not what it had been. The headlights on the truck were not what they had been either, a fact he had been meaning to address. He did not see the water running across the road until he was in it. The truck went sideways, then it went into the ditch. The ditch was not deep, but the angle was wrong and the impact was harder than the description suggests. Hard enough to deploy the airbag, hard enough to leave Earl dazed and bleeding from somewhere above his left eye, hard enough that when he tried to open the door he could not, and when he tried to reach his phone he could not find it in the dark. He sat in the tilted truck in the rain and felt, for the first time in a long time, something he recognized from very deep in his past. He felt afraid, not of dying, not specifically, of being alone in this, of no one coming. It was the fear of a man who has driven everyone away and who, in the moment when driving everyone away has its full consequence, understands what he has done. The headlights of another vehicle appeared on Route 9. Tobias Simmons was 28 years old. Clarence and Ruth's youngest son, who had come back to Harlow 3 years ago after finishing a graduate program in civil engineering, and who was, by general community consensus, one of the finest young men the town had produced in a generation. His wife Della was 26, a pediatric nurse who worked at the county hospital and who had, in 3 years in Harlow, made herself indispensable to more families than she could easily count. They were on their way home from celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary at a restaurant in the next county. They were in good spirits and warm from a good evening, and the rain had complicated the drive, but not the mood. Tobias saw the truck in the ditch from 50 yards out. He pulled over without discussion. Della was out of the passenger door before Tobias had the hazards on. This is the detail worth sitting with. Neither of them knew whose truck it was. Neither of them had processed anything about the situation except that a vehicle was in a ditch in a thunderstorm and someone might need help. The response was not calculated. It was immediate, and it was complete. Tobias got to the driver's door first. He pulled on the handle, stuck, bent by the impact, and pulled again. He and Della together. The door came open. Earl Pruitt looked up at them from the tilted cab. In the light of Tobias's phone, in the rain, with blood on his face and the specific disorientation of a man who has just had a significant impact and is not fully certain of where he is, Earl looked at the 2 people who had come to help him. He said nothing. Tobias said, "Sir, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Earl said, "My head." Tobias said, "Okay, we've got you. Don't move." Della was already on the phone with emergency services. She was giving the location with the specific, calm precision of a nurse who has delivered critical information in high-pressure situations before, and who knows that clarity saves time. Tobias stayed at the door. He reached in and held Earl's hand, not deliberately, not as a gesture, but because Earl's hand was there, and holding it was the natural thing to do when someone is frightened and hurt. Earl did not pull his hand away. The paramedics were 22 minutes out. Tobias and Della stayed. The rain was heavy. Tobias had gotten an emergency blanket from the back of their car, the specific preparedness of a man whose mother had put one in every vehicle her children drove. He draped it around Earl's shoulders through the open door. Della kept Earl talking. She had learned in her nursing training and in her years of practice that keeping a person talking served multiple purposes. It monitored their cognition, it maintained their focus, and it did something more fundamental than either of those things. It kept them with you. She asked him questions, simple ones, his name, what day it was, where he'd been. Earl answered. Slowly at first, then with increasing steadiness as the initial shock gave way to the specific alertness of someone who has something to focus on. At some point, he would not remember exactly when, the sequence of the 40 minutes was not linear in his memory, he became aware of who he was talking to. Not in the abstract, in the specific. He recognized Tobias, not his name yet, but his face, the features of Clarence Simmons, whom he had seen in various configurations over 30 years of neighboring without neighboring. He looked at Tobias. Tobias looked back at him with the simple, direct attention of someone whose entire focus is the well-being of the person in front of him. Earl said, "You're Clarence Simmons's boy." Tobias said, "Yes, sir, Tobias." Earl was quiet. Tobias did not fill the silence. Della said, "How's your vision? Can you track my finger?" Earl tracked her finger. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said in the specific stripped-down register of a man who has had some of his pretenses shaken loose by impact, "Why'd you stop?" Tobias looked at him steadily. He said, "Because you needed help." 3 words. No calculation. No qualification. No reference to the history of 30 years of neighboring without neighboring or the man at the tractor who had not waved back. Because you needed help. Earl looked at him for a long time. The rain kept coming. Della did something about 10 minutes before the paramedics arrived that Earl would carry with him for the rest of his life. She reached through the open door and put her hand on Earl's arm. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, I'd like to pray for you if that's okay, just a short one." Earl had not been prayed over since June's funeral. He had not been in a room where prayer was being said with any sincerity and longer than that. He was a man who had spent 8 years constructing a version of himself that had no use for anyone or anything outside of his own 4 walls. He was sitting in a tilted truck in a ditch in a thunderstorm, with a young woman's hand on his arm and blood on his face, and the specific stripped-down vulnerability of someone who has just had 30 seconds where they were not certain they were going to be okay. He said, "All right." Della prayed. It was not long. It was not elaborate. It was the prayer of a woman who talked to God the way you talk to someone you know, directly, warmly, with the ease of a long relationship. She thanked God for the moment Tobias had seen the truck. She asked for Earl's protection and healing. She asked for peace for him in the scary parts of what was coming. She said his name, peace for Earl. He had not heard anyone say his name with warmth in 8 years. He kept his eyes open during the prayer. He watched the rain on the windshield. He felt something that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. Earl was admitted to Harlow County Hospital with a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, a laceration above his left eye that required 8 stitches, and the general physical accounting of a 74-year-old man who had been in a significant impact. He was expected to be in the hospital for 3 days and was there for 5. Tobias came the following morning. He had called the hospital to ask about Earl's condition. He had been told the condition was stable. He had come anyway. He found Earl in room 114, propped up and looking at the ceiling with the specific expression of a man who has not had much to look at for 8 years and is not used to rooms with other people moving through them. Earl looked at him when he came in. Tobias said, "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Earl said, "I'm all right." Tobias said, "Good." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, not across the room, not at the door. Beside the bed. He asked how the ribs were. He asked about the stitches. He stayed for 40 minutes. He came back the following day. Della came on day 3 with food. Not hospital food, food she had made in a container with a lid that suggested she had done this before for people who needed it. She had made a chicken and rice dish that made the room smell like something Earl's wife had once made in a kitchen on a different kind of evening. He ate it. He said, "You didn't have to do this." Della said, "We wanted to." He looked at her. He said, "After everything?" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The everything contained 30 years of Harlow and the man at the tractor, and the views that the community knew, and the specific way he had looked at people who looked like Della and Tobias his entire adult life. Della said, "Mr. Pruitt, what you needed and what you deserved from us had nothing to do with each other. We stopped because you needed help. We came because we wanted to." She looked at him directly, with the honest, warm steadiness that was simply her character. "That's just how we were raised." Earl looked at the window. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said quietly, in the voice of a man saying something he had not said in a long time or possibly ever, "I'm ashamed." Tobias and Della continued to visit. Not every day, and they had lives, work, the ordinary demands of 2 people building something, but regularly, with a consistency that communicated more than any single visit could, that this was not a gesture. It was a practice. They brought food. They sat with him. Tobias helped him with things at the house in the weeks after he came home, not because Earl asked, but because Tobias showed up one Saturday with tools and a practicality that did not wait for an invitation. The neighbors watched. Harlow is a small town. The sight of Tobias Simmons's truck in Earl Pruitt's driveway on a Saturday morning was information that traveled, and the information it communicated was something Harlow had not expected to be processing about Earl Pruitt. Clarence Simmons, Tobias's father, the man at the tractor, drove past one evening and saw through the lit window of Earl's house his son and Earl Pruitt at the kitchen table over what appeared to be coffee. He sat in his truck for a moment. He said something to himself that he did not repeat to anyone. Then he drove home. Earl was changing. Not dramatically, not overnight. The views that had run in him for 60-something years did not dissolve because of a ditch on Route 9. Change at 74 is slow because the channels are deep and the water has been running in them a long time. But something had been interrupted. The wall that Earl had maintained, not only against Tobias and Della and the community they came from, but against everyone, against warmth itself, against the possibility that someone might see him and not turn away. That wall had a crack in it now. The crack was in the shape of two people who had stood in the rain and held his hand and prayed over him, and brought food and showed up on Saturdays. Without being asked, without conditions, without any visible calculation of return. 6 weeks after the accident, Della asked if he wanted to come to church. She did not press. She asked once with the same directness she brought to everything, and she made it clear that it was an invitation rather than a prescription. She said, "We go on Saturdays. It's a small congregation. Pastor there is a good man. You don't have to believe anything in particular to walk through the door. You just have to walk through it." Earl said he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks. On the third Saturday, he drove himself to Beacon Light Seventh-day Adventist Church in Harlow. The building was modest, a single-story white structure on the east side of town that Earl had driven past for 40 years without looking at directly. The parking lot had perhaps 30 cars in it. Tobias was standing at the door. He did not appear surprised to see Earl. He did not make a production of it. He said, "Glad you came," and opened the door, and that was all. Earl went in. The congregation was 60 people, predominantly black, which Earl was aware of and which he sat with in the specific way of a man who was confronting the geography of his own history. He found a seat near the back. The pastor, a man named Pastor Elias Monroe, 50s, broad and unhurried, with the quality of someone who had been in rooms with complicated people for a long time and had stopped being surprised by them, was preaching from Galatians. He read Galatians 3:28. "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." He said Paul wrote this to a community that was constantly sorting itself, constantly dividing. This group over here, that group over there, the people we trust and the people we don't. And into that community Paul placed a claim that was, in the first century, as radical as anything ever written, that in Christ the categories dissolve. Not that they don't exist in the world, they do, and pretending they don't is not what Paul is saying. He is saying something more specific, that the ground is level at the foot of the cross, that God's love does not require a category to qualify you. It simply requires a person. He paused. Any person, at any point. No matter what they've been carrying, no matter what they've done, no matter where they've been. Earl sat in the third pew from the back of Beacon Light Seventh-day Adventist Church and felt Galatians 3:28 land, in a place that 60-something years of the opposite belief had occupied. Not as an argument that he argued against, as a truth he felt in his body before he could process it in his mind. He thought about the ditch, about two people in the rain, about the hand that reached through the open door of his truck without calculating whether he deserved it, about the prayer that said his name with warmth. Peace for Earl, he thought. If God's love is what reached me through those two people, then God's love does not look like what I was told it looked like. And if God's love does not look like what I was told it looked like, then maybe the rest of what I was told needs looking at too. He stayed for the whole service. After, in the fellowship hall, Della found him with a plate of food. She said, "Well?" He said, "I want to come back." She smiled. Earl Pruitt came back every Saturday. He sat in the same pew for the first month, third from the back aisle seat, the posture of someone who is not yet certain he belongs and who wants the exit available. By the second month, he had moved forward 3 rows. By the third month, he was helping stack chairs after the service because a man who has spent 60 years not knowing what to do with his hands when other people are working is still, underneath everything, a man who knows how to work. Pastor Monroe stopped him one afternoon after a service. He said, "Earl, I want to ask you something. The community food distribution we run on the first Saturday of every month, we could use another set of hands." Earl said, "What does it involve?" Pastor Monroe told him. Earl said, "I can do that." The first Saturday he showed up for the food distribution, he stood behind a folding table in the parking lot of Beacon Light Church and handed food boxes to families from Harlow and the surrounding county. He handed boxes to people who had been driving around him in the grocery store for 20 years. He handed a box to a family he did not recognize. He handed a box to an elderly woman who looked at him and said simply, "God bless you." He said, "Thank you, ma'am." He went home that evening and sat in the house on the rural edge of Harlow that needed painting, and still didn't have it. And he thought about the house and about what it communicated, and about the 11 years since June had passed. He called a painter the following Monday. Clarence Simmons, Tobias's father, the man at the tractor, was driving past on a Tuesday 3 weeks later when he noticed the house had been painted. He slowed down. He stopped. He sat in his truck looking at the painted house for a moment. Then he turned in the driveway. Earl came to the door. Clarence said, "House looks good." Earl said, "Thank you." A pause. "I owe you something." Clarence said, "What's that?" Earl said, "About 30 years of a wave." Clarence looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Well." He extended his hand. "Better late than never." Earl shook it. They stood in the driveway of a painted house on the rural edge of Harlow, Georgia. And the 30 years between them was not erased. Nothing erases 30 years. But something passed between them that was realer than the 30 years and older than either of them. And that had apparently been waiting with considerable patience for this specific Tuesday afternoon. Earl said, "Your boy saved my life." Clarence said, "I know he did." Earl said, "He didn't have to." Clarence looked at him with the measured, steady eyes of a man who has navigated a specific kind of world for 70-some years, and who has arrived, through the length and difficulty of that navigation, at something that looks very much like grace. He said, "No, he didn't." He got back in his truck. He drove away. Earl watched him go. He stood in the driveway of his painted house for a long time. Then he went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tobias had sat across from him over coffee on a Saturday morning, and felt the specific, unfamiliar, entirely real sensation of a man who is no longer alone. Not the absence of loneliness, the presence of something that had replaced it. He was 74 years old. It was not too late. It had never been too late. Galatians 3:28 was written into a world that was sorting itself along every available line. Ethnicity, class, gender, social standing. Paul's declaration was not that those lines didn't exist. They did. They do. Paul's declaration was that at the foot of the cross the lines are irrelevant. That what God sees when he looks at a person is not their category but their soul. Earl Pruitt had spent 60-something years looking at people through the lens of a category he had inherited rather than chosen and had never examined. The lens was given to him in childhood, reinforced by community, and never challenged, because the world he moved through had for a long time reflected it back without friction. The challenge, when it came, did not come in the form of an argument. It came in the form of two people who stood in the rain and held his hand. This is the lesson that Tobias and Della Simmons embody. Not as a strategy, not as a theological position, but as the natural overflow of who they were. That love does not calculate who deserves it before it acts. That the man in the ditch gets the hand regardless of what he has been. Because the measure of love is not the worthiness of the recipient, but the character of the one giving it. This is not naive. Earl Pruitt did not deserve their kindness by any reasonable accounting. That is precisely the point. Grace, by definition, is not deserved. It is given anyway. And it was the undeserved, uncalculated, unconditional nature of what Tobias and Della gave that reached a place in Earl that argument never could have reached, because the wall Earl had built was built against arguments. It had no defense against love. For the Earls in the audience, and there are people who inherited what Earl inherited, who have carried it without examining it, who are perhaps dimly aware that the examination is overdue. The story of Route 9 in a thunderstorm is this: you are not beyond reach. The crack in the wall is available. The question is whether you are willing, when the hand comes through the door, to let it stay. For the Tobias and Della Simmonses in the audience, and they exist, they are real, they are more common than the cynical version of this story allows. What you do when you stop the car matters more than you know. It plants something that may take years to grow and that you may never fully see. Plant it anyway. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. All of us arrive there the same way. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified about more inspirational stories on redemption and hope.